Politics makes strange bedfellows. Also during this time, even though we did cover the 20s last term, the Klan is marching down Washington, D.C. in 1920-21, down Pennsylvania Avenue. So they're a fairly strong political force. Sulfa drug deaths. So sulfa drugs are a form of antibiotic that's fairly toxic. People died when getting those prescribed to them. So the result was Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, safety before marketing. That is, you had to prove a substance was safe before you started selling it. This seems kind of intuitive, right? It would make sense that you would do that, but they didn't. So previously, before this, anyone could market any drug, and it was basically buyer beware. So the only laws passed up to this time required that you, 1, declare opium or cocaine, 2, not make fraudulent claims. Your drug did not have to be safe. You did not have to test it for safety. In fact, there are some patent medicines that actually required you to make out your will before you took them. So when you hear people talking about snake oil vendors, literally they put rattlesnake heads in alcohol and put other things in them and sold that as a curative for whatever condition they wanted to. So when they talk about, if you've heard that phrase, snake oil, that's literally what that was. Medicines that you could make up and sell, didn't even have to test them to see if they're safe. All you had to declare was, is there alcohol, or is there opium or cocaine in it?
Instant death.
Instant death, yeah. Just rattlesnake venom, hey. So, another incident. New Orleans newspaper owned by William Randolph Hearst. Reefer murders, killer weed, reefer madness. In the decade before 1938. And the result was the Marijuana Tax Act of 38. Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs had been created in 1930. Its director testified before Congress that, quote, coloreds with big lips lured white women with jazz and marijuana. Major newspaper publisher associated historically with yellow journalism. That is anti-Asian sentiment. Published stories about blacks and Mexicans, linking the marijuana use of Mexican migrant farm workers with crimes against whites. In 1938, the Marijuana Tax Act, which actually didn't make marijuana illegal, it simply taxed growers, sellers, importers, and had the effect of eliminating all the drugs made from cannabis, as well as hemp cloth, paper, and other products. It should be noted that all big pharma operating in the United States today had medical marijuana products on the market during this time. All of them. In fact, today, Bayer Laboratories out of Germany has a subsidiary in Canada which markets a THC medical marijuana inhaler. It's available in Canada, but not here. Okay, so the use of this particular substance, this particular plant as a medicine goes back thousands of years. Right? So just pointing out that again, how this is being made illegal is not because there's having deaths. Not because they're having problems, but association with minority drug use. I'm not sure what the colors with big lips, yeah, lure white women with jazz and marijuana. Yeah, okay. I admit to doing that myself, but hey, she kind of has to like you first before you get stoned and play Miles Davis kind of lose. You know what I'm saying? I mean, really, people be tripping. Late 40s and 50s, news reports of prevalent urban opiate use among whites and urban blacks, particularly jazz musicians, result in the Narcotic Drug Act of '56, cabaret laws in New York City, So various states passed laws against specific populations based on perception of drug use in order to get cabaret cards, which were essentially permits to play music in New York City. Jazz musicians had to get a cabaret card, which required no drug arrests. Since police were specifically targeting jazz musicians, you couldn't get a cabaret card. So Frank Sinatra actually told the police, Miles Davis is in my band. Any questions? And he don't need no cabaret card. Harry Anslinger, the director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, kept files on prominent black jazz musicians and white musicians who associated with them. He also admitted supplying Senator Joseph McCarthy with morphine so that he would not be blackmailed or supplied by communist agents. So just to make that explicit, Senator Joe McCarthy, who was basically doing this anti-communist thing, was a junkie supplied by the top drug cop, who was not a doctor. So I'm just saying, federal officials breaking their own drug laws and persecuting people, you should watch out for that. Or has issues. Thalidomide disaster, which happened after time, Kefauver-Harris Amendment, no relation. Safety and effectiveness before marketing. What thalidomide was a drug that was given to pregnant women as a tranquilizer, and what it did essentially was make monsters of the babies. And fortunately for the United States, most of the thalidomide babies were born overseas, so we were able to stop it. Then in the next incident, the 60s, and so when you see that phrase, what comes to mind in popular culture?
The 60s?
The 60s, right.
The radical hippie movement?
The radical hippie movement, right. Not so much the black civil rights movement or black power or anything, the hippies, right? Well, the result of the 60s was the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention and Control Act of 1970, the Controlled Substances Act. So here's what was happening. Large numbers of white middle-class youth began adopting non-mainstream minority group values, including the loose use of hallucinogens and marijuana as quasi-sacraments, rejecting materialism, respect for the earth, freely sharing possessions and genetic materials, feminism, egalitarian relationships, nonviolent social change, the ecology movement, okay, reaching out to ethnic minorities. This is dangerous stuff. So what we need is laws to stop that. That's a problem. So, up until 1968, I remember, because I was there, when Cheech and Chong, you can find this on iTunes, the weed commercial, that's what it's called. No sticks and stems that you don't need. Acapulco Gold is badass weed.
That's pretty good.
Two tobacco companies, Philip Morris and RJR Nabisco, trademark names for marijuana cigarettes. They were anticipating that if Eugene McCarthy got in the White House, a Democratic candidate, that marijuana would be legalized. And so they were moving ahead of that, which, you want to look at this, where the smart money goes, this is what they do. So, Nixon was elected president instead of McGovern. McGovern, did I say McCarthy? McCarthy was running too, come to think of it. Anyway, plans were scrapped as Nixon favored tough drug laws and conspiracy laws. These were used to suppress political movements. So, as an example, abuse. Set that up. Medically, abuse is defined in the current DSM as continued use despite negative consequences, which could be physical, psychological, social, legal, occupational, but short of dependence, which means essentially addiction. Right? So that's what it means medically. Legally and conservatively, for some people, any use of an illegal substance breaks the law and leads to the schema or the concept, use is abuse. But that's a political position, not a medical position. Simple use does not constitute abuse medically. So, Controlled Substances Act was a compromise between those who wanted criminal penalties, law and order, and those who wanted treatment and rehabilitation. So it was considered like a compromise. Sets up 5 levels of drug control, Schedule 1s through 5, with penalties. So a drug was assessed for its historical and current potential for abuse and its medical use. High abuse potential and no medical use was Schedule 1, so marijuana, peyote, LSD, hallucinogens, heroin. High abuse potential and medical use were Schedule 2, so amphetamines, cocaine, and barbiturates. I want you to, well, consider that list for a second. So for example then, other drugs with abuse potential but lower risk, such as paregoric, codeine cough syrups, fell farther down on the schedules. So there are 2 drugs with high abuse potential, no medical use. They're not mentioned in the schedule. Alcohol, tobacco, killing more people. History of abuse potential. They were actually originally included but were lobbied out of the final bill. Because we do have the best politicians money can buy. So here it is charted out. So medical use, non-officially, even though marijuana was a legal drug, medically had a medical use prior to 1938. Under 1970, it was not. So, heroin, marijuana, peyote, LSD, foxy, opiates, MDMA, various hallucinogens. Call your attention to peyote. Why class peyote with heroin? Well, who uses peyote?
Native Americans.
Native Americans. And some whites that, are able to score, because have you ever heard of anybody knocking over a bank for their peyote habit? Well, peyote, according to Western science, is not addictive. And, having done it, you can see why. I use the peyote scale to talk about. It's very bitter. I mean, it's probably one of the few plants that you could eat fresh that won't kill you, where it makes you immediately want to throw up. Because the alkaloid, your body is designed to think of alkaloids as poisons, and as soon as you bite into it, you want to throw up. But part of the ritual, that actually is part of the whole ceremony in terms of that, and that's been ritualized. Throwing up part. But as a hallucinogen, it basically doesn't change what we'll call consensus reality. Like we all agree, if I tell you, don't think about pink elephants. No, don't think about pink elephants.
First thing that
Stop thinking about pink elephants. All right? We all agree that there ain't no pink elephants in the room unless you're on acid now. But peyote does not produce hallucinations that you can necessarily see, like that. You can see them in your head, but you can't see them out here, like LSD does.
What's Foxy?
It's basically a MDA derivative. It's another designer drug.
Same with the MDMA, what is that?
MDMA, ecstasy, MDA, MDMA, ecstasy, they're all related. They're basically amphetamine type hallucinogens. MDMA is kind of like a combination between methamphetamine and peyote, chemically speaking. So similar. In any case, the point is, there's never been a public health problem with peyote. Never. Okay? Its sole use is as a sacrament of the people of color. So why ban it? Because the people who use it basically ascribe to certain values that are non-materialistic, that are ecologically based, that are more egalitarian. In other words, the form of society that Anheuser-Busch would not support having happen. To contrast that. Because notice Anheuser-Busch and Philip Morris are not on this list, even though they kill the most people. You've heard me say that legal drugs kill more people every day than died at 9/11? You've heard me say that? I'll say it now. Legal drugs kill more people than died at 9/11. Okay? So let's say that's 3,000. In that same time period, that is a day, 55 people will die from illegal drugs versus 3,000. So why is the war on drugs not on alcohol and tobacco, where the body count is, and pharmaceuticals?
Because money talks.
Money does talk. Hopefully yours knows more than just goodbye. All right, Schedule 2, medical or military use. So the military use of methamphetamine is for fighter pilots and ADHD kids. Pharmaceutical methamphetamine, also college students, fake prescriptions for fake ADHD and use Adderall, which is what methamphetamine is, and can become addicted to that. So, Controlled Substances Act.
Adderall is an addiction? Is it an addictive drug?
Yeah, it's methamphetamine.
Wow.
Oh, you didn't know that?
No.
No.
Okay, so I'm not trying to be all conspiracy theory about you, but it's like, basically, here's how this works. Controlled Substances Act. Here's how this works. Okay, so if you notice, production control, government permit, and then below Schedule 2. So Schedules 3 through 4, 5, you don't need a government permit. Controlled Substances Act. If you choose on your own to manufacture a drug and or sell it without a government permit, you're violating this act. Okay? So at the federal level, you can't get a permit for growing weed unless it's for research, which the government does permit weed growing for research if you're connected with a university or a lab, right? If you want to make methamphetamine, when you get busted for having a meth lab, it's for producing methamphetamine without a license. Pretty much. Or marijuana grows that are prosecuted federally, too. Same idea, right? So, you just need a permit. But who decides when and where you get a permit, in terms of the government? Under what conditions? How big do you have to be? All those kind of things. So, the other Tuskegee. So, if on a midterm near you, you see a question that asks about 2 references to Tuskegee, you know one, that's the airmen, and this one. So, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So, on the upside, the Tuskegee experiment used a culturally sensitive approach using churches, healthcare workers, plantation owners, teachers, and others as informants. So, basically, when people, I guess there's no gentle way of putting this, STDs and STIs, sexually transmitted disease, sexually transmitted infections, have been around with humankind for a while. All right? They happen. Now, they're preventable, generally speaking. Barrier methods, antibiotics, drug therapies, etc. Okay? They are. Now, usually when something becomes an epidemic means it's basically proliferating out of control. Hence the term epidemic, right? So, Tuskegee syphilis experiment was originally funded by the U.S. Public Health Service as a multi-pronged prevention program. And as it's a scientific experiment, which the experimental design was setting up control groups. That is, you have a treatment group and a control group. Treatment group gets all the things you want to prevent the disease. The control group gets nothing. Now, one of the control groups was 400 rural black men.
Lab rats.
Yeah, lab rats, right? So, on the surface, it was a great program for delivering health care or addressing health-related problems using all those different places that people encounter where they might get prevention information. So, for example, in certain black communities where they have barber shops, where black men go, for their weekly haircut, they actually have people in there with blood pressure cuffs, addressing hypertension, one of the major killers of black men, black people in general, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension. Okay, let's get your blood pressure checked. How are your sugars today? Right? So, on the surface, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a great way of delivering prevention services. Unfortunately, no treatment was delivered. Details. But public health services reluctance, and even while I was taking public health classes towards a doctorate before they kicked me out, they said, "Oh, we're not reluctant to discuss it." Yeah, you are. Fosters distrust in black communities regarding AIDS prevention efforts to this day. So, whether or not HIV was a naturally occurring virus or an escaped bioweapon, prevention, treatment, access is not equitable in this country, and definitely in places like South Africa, where it was whites only, leading to a proliferation of AIDS on the continent. Because it's a sexually transmitted disease, primarily. In the United States, that is not the case, because there was people with, drug problems that are having sex with people. So, globally, transmission of AIDS is a heterosexual disease. But we'll talk about that in the 80s, right? So, AIDS prevention in the U.S. depends on health literacy, activism, and community awareness. That is, individually, you have to be aware of not only your infection status, but the infection status of your partner, which means you need to be able to interpret, home testing, being willing to do that, or at least using barrier methods each and every time. So, Tuskegee experiment. Culturally defining metaphor, reality, history, and exemplar. That is an example of science gone wrong. Okay? So, the social context. Syphilis is an epidemic across a number of races and socioeconomic cohorts, that is groups. Primarily vectored, that is spread. Vector is public health term for how something spreads by unfaithful married men. This is in the 20s and 30s. The stereotype in the 20s and 30s was an unfaithful married white man who brought syphilis back to his wife. And these were demonized like gay men were with AIDS in the 80s. So we see these recursive patterns. Okay, so the stereotype in the 30s, well, nobody gets syphilis except, men who cheat on their wives with prostitutes, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. Right? So moral rather than a scientific approach. Okay, so gay men in the 80s, no, only a few of them, were responsible for vectoring AIDS. That's where it first showed up in the U.S., but globally, even at that time, it was vectored by heterosexuals. So not a gay disease. But in the 80s, we were way more stupider than we are now. Not that we're all that smart. Okay, so 1929 to 31, Tuskegee experiment started as a public health study. The primary goal was to prove rural blacks could be tested and treated for syphilis. Prevalence ran up to 40%. So 40% of rural black men were infected with syphilis at the time. Right? The Great Depression wiped out monies for the treatment component. So notice the timing. October 29th was the stock market crash. Black Friday, 29. So the Depression wiped out treatment money for this study. The treatment component. So the decision was made to allow nearly 400 men to go untreated for 40 years instead of 6 to 9 months as originally planned. The untreated cohort was basically 100% black. The result is that they would infect their wives and children, who would also go untreated because they were only allowed to see doctors and nurses who were ordered as part of the experiment to give them placebos, i.e. sugar pills, instead of the cure, which was penicillin.
Before, this is...
Oh, well, basically the cure for syphilis had been discovered, and they also essentially knew what happened when you don't treat syphilis. It eventually kills you, makes you go eventually, because it destroys nerve tissue, you go crazy, a number of other things while infecting people, right?
They decided to go the 40 years instead of 6 to 9 months after.
Right, so they were going to be untreated for only 6 to 9 months in the original program, right? Because remember, I said the way you set up an experimental design, you have a treatment group and a control group. But the control group was all black, right? So the treatment group got treatment. They were white. Treatment was simply penicillin. And they were just going to allow the black men, originally in the original design, to go untreated for 6 to 9 months, because after all, it's the U.S. Public Health Service whose goal is to be the doctor for the country, which means we're preventing disease, not allowing disease to go unchecked. If we can do anything about it, since what we can do about it is give them penicillin. So basically, penicillin wasn't that expensive even then. But the people that they would basically go to see, doctors, nurses, etc., would not give them penicillin because they were ordered not to give them penicillin. Okay, so the rationale for doing this, or one of the rationales, the more damaging the disease appeared to be, the greater the pressure on Southern legislatures to fund treatment. Like Southern legislatures who are white have always had the health and welfare of poor rural blacks uppermost in their minds. So, when you read this, and I'm as a student thinking, wait, this is what you were teaching? Are you serious? This was actually their rationale? Who's writing this? Because this seems, maybe it's just because I'm black, it just seems stupid, incredibly stupid, even if you're black, to believe that. And you're teaching me this, there's a teacher teaching me this in public health. Really? Seriously?
Is that before or after they took the peyote?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, so when penicillin was used for syphilis treatment in 1943, the Tuskegee subjects, quote unquote, were excluded. In the words of a key scientist, they were subjects, not patients. clinical material, not sick people. Okay, they're not humans, they're lab rats. Well, it is 43, after all. In 1969, a blue ribbon Centers for Disease Control, CDC, panel voted to continue the study to endpoint. That's code for till all the subjects had died. This is in 69. So they're still lab rats, not people. So, before this point, the endpoint of syphilis infection was well documented information since the 20s and 40s. There's no moral justification, i.e. a greater social good, other than preserving the integrity of a scientific experiment. And again, only the black rural cohort went untreated. 72, a white CDC interviewer blows the whistle to the press, ending the experiment. So blacks had actually complained earlier to no effect. So again, how white privilege works. Blow the whistle to the press. Do they report it? Not? Yes? All right. So in addition to dozens of men's lives being lost or shortened, 22 wives, 17 children, 2 grandchildren contracted syphilis because they couldn't get treatment. So imagine if this had this, you do a photo reverse. Would this happen with white people? Probably not, but yes, it has happened. Not that the CDC wants to talk about that either. But it has later. So, when your government does you wrong, naturally people's mind turn to litigation, right? Lawyer up. So, if this had happened to you, what would you want from the government?
Great.
Huh?
A lot.
Well, what's a lot?
I don't know. It's not just-
Well, no, think about it. You were deliberately, okay, you were infected. Maybe you knocked boots with somebody that was infected, and then you went to your healthcare professional, and they gave you sugar pills instead of penicillin. Okay? In litigation, just so you know, in terms of tactics of battle, you go for the deepest pockets. The doctor, the government, who directed the doctor,
Yeah.
right? So what would you want? Lifetime medical?
For my family.
No, because that would be like,
It'd
you
have
wouldn't
to
be
be
able to
for
trust the.
No. You want the cost of lifetime medical where you can at least pay for your own doctor outside of their control, right? No, think
At
big
minimum.
picture,
Yeah.
right? At minimum, right? If you died,
I would want my family taken care of.
you want your family taken care of, and how big is that? Let me give you some. Let me give you. Okay, at my level of income, 45-year work life. I mean, you do the math at $50 an hour. That's several million. Okay, over a lifetime, right? Even at minimum wage, that's still like $500,000. Well, do the math, right? So you want that plus damages plus lifetime medical. We're talking easily 10 million. Because we're only talking about 400 folks here, right? Some have died, et cetera, right? Sound reasonable? We're going to ask for 10 million. Figured they're going to settle, right?
Considering you gave your life, yeah.
Yeah, right? Does that sound reasonable, y'all?
I mean, I would want enough to shut the CDC down.
Yeah,
But it wouldn't.
I would think about that too, right? Sure. Okay, so you're gonna, I'll just show you, because this is deep. So first, what they do is HEW, that is now Health and Human Services, but then it was Health, Education, and Welfare. Their human subject regulations revamped. So informed consent being a key provision. So this is why all universities, including us, Lane Community College, we have to follow these federal regs because of Tuskegee. So this is part of the good that came out of it. Theoretically, this can't ever happen again because you have to be informed, even if I just ask questions. Any kind of research, you have to be informed of what the study is doing, what the outcomes are, what the potential benefits and or risks are to you. Up front, in writing. Okay, it's human subjects. In 1973, $1.8 billion class action lawsuit was filed in Alabama. Which, that's a lot of money in 1973 dollars. Okay, if we were doing it today, then it's close to 50 to 100 billion. But 1.8 billion. So just to put that in context, in case you have never worked out what $1 billion would mean to you personally. You know, Bill Gates is a billionaire, Warren Buffett is a billionaire. Just the interest in the bank on $1 billion, you would live comfortably. But $1 billion, if you're going to spend it, say $10,000 a day, in case you can't conceive of spending more than 10 grand a day. That's 10 grand a day every day for 274 years. But most of us are not vampires. So if you're going to spend $1 billion in a year, that's 10 million a day for a year. That's really living large. All right, so this is still 1.8 billion among, the survivors of 400 folks. That's still a fair piece of change in rural Alabama in 1973, right? So that's hefty. Here's what happened. 74, government settles out of court for 10 million. Which is, like you do the math, that's $15,000 for a survivor, at or less than $10,000 for a death. I mean, my accidental death and dismemberment policy of Lane Community College pays more than 10 grand. There's an ethnic slur that I'm not going to, voice here that basically is mischaracterizing a particular group for wanting a deal. Like, lots of us want deals. Right? Tuskegee is worse than that. It should be Tuskegee down rather than the other thing. Tuskegee, the government Tuskegee'd us down. Yeah. Okay, so 1/180th of the asking price. Our government did work. Okay, so nothing for lifetime medical, pain and severing, loss of income, none of that. But the lawyer got $1 million. He's a lawyer. Yeah. So you can see where people would have some issues with this, right? So the belief that AIDS is an escape bioweapon developed by and released by the U.S. government kind of stems from the Tuskegee experiment. That belief in that meme in the black community. Okay? Bolstered by the fact that the U.S. government also had an ethnic-specific bioweapon development program as a result of the civil rights / Black Power movements, which spread to other groups, Asians, American Indians, Chicanos, which basically were specific ethnic-specific bioweapon programs targeted at each of those groups, because each of those groups also participated in the civil rights and other ethnic power movements during the 60s and early 70s. So this was indirectly acknowledged through the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We'll talk more about that in the year 2000s, but suffice is to say, like, it used to be believed that we on the left were paranoid that the government was creating bioweapons against us. Well, it was actually true. We weren't paranoid. And it was bolstered by this testimony. The project, if you want to look it up, the South African project was called Project Coast, where this doctor testifies, oh yeah, we got aid in and basically we were targeting Mandela and all these other folks with the ANC, the anti-apartheid activists, and we got help from the United States, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Israel, names 13 other countries. Yes. Your eyebrow raised, yes, Israel participated in ethnic-specific bioweapons research with South Africa. Gave them the technology, more or less for free. But so did the US, so did the Soviet Union. So, the fallout. So, three theories are on the origin of HIV according to an AIDS textbook that I was directed to teach out of, so, okay. I did. One, it's a naturally occurring virus which jumps species. Dicey, but has happened with Ebola, prions, some STDs like gonorrhea, which got introduced in human populations by humans having sex with sheep, I think it was. Naturally occurring virus, endemic in a small population of humans, probably Africans, which spread due to urbanization of Africa. Basically, there are places called like the AIDS Highway in which long-haul truck drivers have unprotected sex with prostitutes and basically vector the virus that way. And it started, so with one, the virus is probably being harbored, if it's a naturally occurring virus, then it's probably harbored in some other species in which it wasn't hot, because if you understand how viruses work, they don't want to kill the host. They want to replicate. And if they kill their host too fast, that doesn't help with the goal of replication too well. So the virus evolves to less lethal forms. Hence, for example, like the herpes viruses. Herpes viruses, the 13 different kinds of herpes that infect humans, not all of them are fatal, like measles, like, warts, like cold sores, like etc. Right? Chicken pox, shingles. Chicken pox and shingles are the same virus. So, naturally occurring virus, endemic in a small population that got vectored out. 3, U.S. engineer, this is a trip when I read this, and okay, I'm teaching it. You want me to teach this, you guys selected the book, so okay, I'm going to teach this. And U.S. engineered bioweapon developed and field tested in Africa in a UN vaccine program and in 2 cohorts of a gay male STD study in New York and San Francisco. Hence, the African populations, and then the first appearance in this country in gay men in 2 STD studies in New York and San Francisco. Now, usually what happens with bioweapons, if you study the military projects with these, they're usually engineered for a quick kill. AIDS, really as a weapon, is slow. And it's random because it's an STD. You can't predict who's going to have sex with who. And if it takes 10 years to kill you, but could be accelerated by other infections or drug abuse or alcoholism, etc., that's still kind of random. So, again, bioweapons, usually engineered for quick kill, aerosol delivery. STD is too slow and random. It's too easy to kill the HIV virus, except that it can only be transmitted by fairly intimate contacts in the fluids that it's transmitted in. Exposed to air, it dies quickly, unlike herpes, which can live for a few minutes, for a few minutes more. All right, but if you don't care who it infects, well, if you don't care who it infects, if you believe that sections of the government might willingly develop and test biological weapons on undesirable or unvulnerable populations, if you believe that, I'm just playing this out, then how would you protect yourself? So if it was engineered, we should be thankful that it wasn't engineered to be as virulent, that is powerful and prolific as the common cold. It could be vectored in the sneeze. Should be lucky that that isn't the case. Still comes down to, even if you believe that, in the quote-unquote conspiracy theory that it's a bioweapon, which I've heard in black circles lots of times, the question that I pose is, how do you protect yourself? How would you devise a defense or cure? See, because that's another piece. If you think the government created it, then theoretically they got a cure. Maybe. Or a defense, or a vaccine. But if they developed it as a weapon, you think they're going to leave evidence of a cure around? No. They don't do that. So, how would you devise a defense or a cure? How would you aggressively go on the offense rather than be a potential passive victim? And I'm not saying that you re-engineer a virus and vector it to the government. That's not what I'm saying. So the thought is tempting. I admit it. Turnabout is not fair play in this sense because you can't control who will get to. Okay, how would you aggressively go on the offense and rather than be a potential victim? Okay, and teach others to do the same. So it's one thing to believe in conspiracy theories. Yes, they are entertaining, especially if they might not be theories. It's another to recognize a systemic attack and respond to it effectively. So I often do worst case scenario. Okay, if it's a bioweapon, here's how dangerous it is. Are they going to release more virulent forms? Are they going to depopulate the planet? Look, the clock is ticking for all of us. So, best defense is a well-lived life. All right. So, the lines of attack to prevent community mobilization. So, whether you believe AIDS is a bioweapon or not, how do you mobilize to prevent that attack? Well, you need your own scientists, your own virologists, your own microbiologists. You need people to do good health care on your own so that you don't fall prey to it. There are a number of organizations within the black community that were organized to do exactly that and to mobilize the community.
What did Magic Johnson do?
Magic Johnson.
My man looks better than ever.
Well, yeah. Well, because he can afford,
Right,
with
whatever.
TGIF, Starbucks, health clubs, the Dodgers. Magic's done very well with his career. Yes, and that means he can afford the best and most expensive drugs to basically drop his viral count down to undetectable.
It kind of sucked because he got diagnosed the same time my uncle.
92?
Yeah, 92, between 89 and 92, that's when he got diagnosed with it.
Yeah.
He died in 95, you
Yeah.
know, and there was no kind of medical coverage that would cover
Right.
that kind of stuff whatsoever.
Right. Then, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's why just hearing his name irritates me.
Yeah.
Magic Johnson, you know.
Right. Yeah, which probably meant that, your uncle got diagnosed, or not, he got diagnosed in 92, but he's probably infected a decade before with the progression of the disease.
Yeah, he had full-blown AIDS at the end.
Yeah.
He died of kidney failure.
Right. So part of what happens in terms of understanding, being health literate, medically literate, understanding, okay, right, you could be carrying this, the virus basically is like Ebola on slow. Basically, Ebola does in 3 weeks what AIDS takes a decade to do. Except Ebola basically destroys everything that isn't bone. AIDS just destroys your immune system, nervous system, et cetera, and it takes a decade to do it. Symptoms only show up, in the last 3-4 years of life, depending on what your lifestyle is. If you're doing things like you're addicted to alcohol or drugs, your immune system gets trashed that way, the virus progresses faster, right? So, the lines of attack to prevent community mobilization, whether it's STDs or addiction.
I was going to say one thing about that.
Yeah.
The UK came out saying how they admitted that they did biochemical testing through the airplanes on the population. So that's documented.
Yeah. Somehow I'm just not surprised. So, flood communities with addictive drugs. Destroy spiritual, political, economic, educational, or cultural movements which inhibit the spread of drugs and counter addictive culture. Resist any attempt to reform the school curriculum beyond the white supremacist model. Attack or destroy ethnic studies. Allow physical and personal environments to become polluted with chemical and biological agents, lead in paint, lead in gasoline, lead in water. Biological organisms, STDs in water, toxins, food supply. So I'm not saying that putting STDs in your drinking water. I'm just saying the means and access to prevention. Okay, so even if you don't have a government-funded infrastructure to prevent that kind of stuff like in a public health service, the community needs to be able to respond on its own independently of those things. But if the community is not organized to do that, and you destroy not only the people that are capable of doing that, but any agencies that are capable of doing that, and you do that deliberately, then you develop a host of problems. All right, so the lines that we were attacked along those lines that I just talked about. So we attacked back by developing systems of personal mastery, personal and communal community self-sufficiency, cultural interdependence. So the remembrance of the covenant, that is, we're all the same people, however we look, however differently we look, but we need to basically build our own cultural strengths within our culture and then build strength in between culture. Culturally inclusive curricula, so ethnic, women, interdisciplinary studies, the organic food movement, ecology, women's and reproductive rights, STD prevention, environmental racism movement, culturally competent gang prevention. All these things start in the 70s and 80s. And we're also systematically attacked, right? So even at Lane Community College, when ethnic studies was created in the 70s in response to student activism, with increasing enrollment internal to the program, I was just interviewed by questioned by someone who was looking in the archives, the official story. Well, the Board of Education, in eliminating ethnic studies, said it was low enrollment. Wait, no, enrollment was increasing. And by the way, you didn't set a lower limit for basket weaving, and we had more students than basket weaving. Why aren't you eliminating that? But, so, part of that national movement to eliminate ethnic studies, which has now come around again in Arizona and other places. So I understand this stuff is dangerous, and that's why I'm making it as dangerous as possible. Because I've always operated under the assumption that they could end it at any time, even though it's making the money. So, money isn't the issue, then what is it really? So, the Vietnam War, which will end in the decade that we're looking at, the 70s. It was a conflict which was sold as bringing democracy and freedom to Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was, of course, our ally against the Japanese during World War II. The Vietnamese would have traded strategic minerals and oil with the U.S. had we not handed Vietnam back to the French. They were fighting for the country's independence. We were fighting for tin and tungsten. So the Phoenix program involved destroying the Vietnamese cultural and intellectual infrastructure. Today we define terrorism as the use of force, deadly force, against a civilian population. That is, if you're not a standing army. This was terrorism by the United States government against the Vietnamese, because you're basically killing anybody that's a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, non-combatant, and basically the idea was to prevent basically the ability of the Vietnamese people to come back from the war, to essentially target the infrastructure. Right? So Agent Orange, also known as Roundup, poisoned Vietnamese people for generations to come, as well as Vietnam veterans, and people are spreading it on their lawns today. Ultimately, millions of Vietnamese were killed and over 55,000 Americans died in the conflict that ended in '75. Last 2 minutes, the Wilmington 10. In '71, schools in Wilmington, North Carolina, Michael Jordan's hometown, were still segregated 17 years after Brown v. Board's all deliberate speed. Black students were planning to boycott the high school due to racism on the part of students and teachers. They wanted black studies curricula and an observance of Martin Luther King's birthday. That's in '71, 3 years after the assassination. Ben Chavis was called in to provide leadership for the students. They were meeting in church. They organized when in a series of attacks they were fired upon in the church. People were doing drive-bys. They called the police to come stop the shootings, but the police would never come. And how do you know it's not the police firing at you? White business in the black community was firebombed, taking 2 black residents along with it. Took the prosecution a year to construct a case that named and eventually convicted 8 black high school students, 1 white woman, and Ben Chavis as co-conspirators in arson and terrorism. Which they didn't do, of course, but the white woman was freed. The rest went to prison for 10 years. So, here are your midterms. You have a week to give them back. You don't have to take a week. It'll be on the website shortly. Do your own work. Good luck.